Good evening. Thank you for joining us for the Tri-State Trail Summit. I'm Wade Johnston. I'm the Director of Tri-State Trails at Green Umbrella. We're so disappointed that we're not meeting in person this year. This is normally an engaging day-long event where we can celebrate everything our region has accomplished over the past year. But here we are in another Zoom call. I just want to say thank you for taking time out of your day to participate in this discussion with us. Tonight, we're looking forward to a keynote address from Tamika Butler. First, I'm going to run through some housekeeping and provide a brief update of the progress we've made in 2020. You have been automatically muted for now, and we request that you turn your video off during the presentation. If you have a question during the presentation, please write it in the chat so we can revisit it at the end. After the presentation, we will have a Q&A session with Tamika where you can unmute and turn on your video if you would like to ask a question live. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors. Thank you to Great Parks of Hamilton County for supporting our summit as a Trailblazer level sponsor. Tim Zellick, the Chief of Planning at Great Parks, is with us this evening to say a few words.
Thanks, Wade. Great Parks is thrilled to be the presenting sponsor for Tri-State Trails Virtual Summit and keynote speaker Tamika Butler. I've heard such great things about Tamika. I'm really looking forward to her program. As many of you know, Great Parks completed a comprehensive master plan in 2019, and the number one priority that came out of that plan was to build more trails. We've just completed public engagement for the Park and Facility Master Plan, the follow-up to the comprehensive master plan, and we're getting the same results with trails being the overwhelming request for the future. As a result, we've made that our priority and have several projects underway. We've just completed the Columbia Connector, part of the Crown, and we'll be starting the Beachmont Bridge Trail this winter. We recently received a grant for the first phase of the Glenwood Gardens to Winton Woods Trail, and we're involved in a portion of the Mill Creek Trail. COVID, as you know, has affected us all greatly. It has shown us the importance of green space and trails to our community. We've seen a 63% increase in trail use this year because of the pandemic. I want to thank Wade, most of all, for the work he has done to raise the level of interest in trails in our region. Wade and Tri-State Trails has done an amazing job bringing trails to the forefront of transportation discussions. And we are years ahead of where we were a short time ago because of Wade's work. So thank you, Wade. I have a little more to say. I just want to say how thrilled I am to be involved and working on trails with you. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Tim. And thanks again to Great Parks for being one of our sponsors. I also want to thank our navigator level sponsors here, Human Nature, Montgomery Cyclery, Ohio's Bike Lawyer, Steve Magus, and the River West Working Group, who is working on the Ohio River Trail West. We also want to say thanks to the 25 or so of you who made a donation with your registration. We really appreciate it. And we have a donor who appreciates it too. I am excited to announce that we have a 2-for-1 matching grant starting now and running through the end of the year. For every dollar you donate, the DeVue Good Foundation will match it with $2 to support the work to our work in 2021. To make a donation, you can visit tristatetrails.org/donate. What a year it has been. The COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically changed all of our lives. My wife and I have 3 children under the age of 10, and we still feel so overwhelmed and cooped up and isolated. And not a day goes by where I don't think about how lucky and privileged I am to have a stable life situation right now when so many other families are in crisis mode or on the brink of it. One silver lining that has helped me stay grounded during this global crisis is that more people have been choosing to go outside and are hopefully becoming advocates for public spaces like trails and parks. We want to take a quick poll to gauge how this trend applies to our audience. Let's see if this works.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, yeah, we've got 61 of the 73 viewers currently voted, so 84%, that's a pretty good voter participation. Thank you, everyone. But overwhelming 63% to I have used trails and bikeways more since the beginning of the pandemic. 32% says I've used trails and bikeways the same, and only 5% saying I've used trails and bikeways less. So great job, everyone, for making the most of things and getting out there more. To the second question, which mode have you used most during the pandemic on the trails? Number one was walking, 52%. And I know that's true for me as well. 37% hiking, 19% running, and not a rollerblader or a scooter, but I'd be interested to hear the 41% other, what mode of transportation that is. So thank you everyone for participating.
Thanks a lot, Jesse. So as more people are turning to get outside more, we have responded in creating a new website, tristatetrails.org, which is a more user-friendly and much improved tool for us to promote our region's trail and bikeway network to residents and visitors. Through our trail monitoring program, we have been able to document how trail usage has increased this year compared to last year. Trail usage is up between 35 and 65% overall from January through September compared to last year at four of the 5 locations that we have trail monitors. The Purple People Bridge is the only trail to have a decrease in trail usage as a result of the pandemic, about 9% overall, even though it's still our highest volume trail corridor. And we think this is because there's just less commuting traffic and so many large events have been canceled. But you know, I think the poll that we just shared and the trail usage trends that we're monitoring are a good indication that people are turning to trails and bikeways now to maintain their physical and mental health during this unprecedented time. And with this new captive audience, now is the time to capitalize on this momentum. So in addition to launching our new website, we've also launched our first PSA campaign this year, thanks to funding from the Kentucky Bicycle and Bikeways Commission, which you can view on our website. In addition to changing hearts and minds, our core focus is to connect and expand the trail and bikeway network. Despite the pandemic, we've been able to make some significant progress in 2020. About 41 miles of trails and bikeways have been constructed this year, and that's the yellow that you're seeing on the map. Next year, we are expecting about another 10 miles to be built. That's the pink on the map. And in 2022 and beyond, looking out several years, we're expecting another 29 miles to be built. That's what's shown in red. Tri-State Trails has been working behind the scenes with many communities to coordinate the funding that has created this momentum. And this year, we're proud to have doubled our staff from 1 to 2, so we have more capacity to do more. And we're excited to have Rachel Cully, our new trail and bikeway coordinator, on our team. Her first day was the first day of lockdown during the pandemic. So it's been fun to develop a working relationship through a computer. Oh, excuse me. And we know that trails and bike lanes are really just a starting point of what needs to be improved. Thanks to the DeVue Good Foundation, Northern Kentucky got 600 new bike racks, and Cincinnati is getting over 1,000 over the next 2 years. We've started to install bike repair stations at more locations around the region, and we've set up a gear donation grant program where groups can request bike commuting essentials like lights, locks, helmets, and more to expand access in communities that really need it. You may have noticed that our advocacy has shifted in recent years to prioritize building out our urban cores trail and bikeway network and prioritizing it in communities that really need it. In my opinion, this is some of our most impactful work and some of our most important work. Just think, what if you didn't have access to parks or trails during this time? And for so much of our population, especially in the urban core, that's a reality. So we've got a couple maps we want to show you just to kind of highlight this trend. So this first map is median income. We've got our trails overlaid on that. That's the black lines and the blue lines with the white on them. And you can see that in our urban core, where we don't have great trail connectivity or really the long expansive trail corridors like we have in some of the suburban areas, is where our lower income individuals are concentrated. And then let's look at race. So for white communities, we see a similar trend. Except it's the opposite. You know, we've got much of our white population is concentrated in the suburbs. And again, in the urban core, we're not seeing that connectivity. And then finally, let's look at our African-American community. You can see kind of in the center of Hamilton County, again, where the trail connectivity does not exist currently, is where the large concentrations of African American communities are. And so, I mean, this to me highlights the importance of why we really need to be prioritizing making these connections in communities that can really benefit from having trails in their communities, both for transportation benefits, but also the physical and mental health. And trails should not be something that's exclusive to a certain population in Greater Cincinnati. One of the projects I'm most proud of is CROWN, the Cincinnati Riding or Walking Network. We've been working for a little over 5 years now to bring stakeholders together to fulfill this vision for a 34-mile trail loop around Greater Cincinnati. And over the past 2 years, we've created a partnership with the Wasson Way and the Ohio Riverway organizations to launch a fundraising campaign to leverage state and federal grants to build out this vision. Last year, we secured $6 million to connect the Wasson Way Trail to Avondale and build out most of the Wasson Way vision. And this is so critical because for the first time now, Avondale and the Uptown community are going to be connected to this trail system. Just earlier this month, we secured another $3.8 million to bring that connection all the way to the intersection of Martin Luther King and Reading Road. So this whole connection here in number 2 in red is now funded partially. And we know that our work needs to continue on this front. We plan to continue to work to secure state and federal grants to build out this vision. And we know that trails are not going to always be the solution that we can accomplish in the urban core just because of the constraints with land and the funding that's available. And so thanks to the support from the Hale Foundation and REI Cincinnati, we started to do more advocacy work in Lower Price Hill and in the Mill Creek Valley so that we can start to lay the groundwork for those connections. We've also developed our active transportation policy platform, which is the first time we've done something like this. We've tried to highlight all of the ideas and projects and concepts that we think can help change the game and make biking and walking easier in Greater Cincinnati. And so this is focused around 5 principles, and you can look at this on our website in detail. But really, we need to start rethinking how we plan and design our roadways and how we plan and design our bike and pedestrian infrastructure. We need to look at the tools in our toolbox, like zoning and other regulations, and use those to our advantage so that we can incrementally build these connections over time, instead of the massive investment we need now to get the connectivity that we want to see. We also need to prioritize equity more in this conversation, which is part of the reason why we want to talk about this more in detail tonight. And then we need more funding. We need better local sources that we can leverage against these state and federal grants. And we need to be doing a better job at maintaining and improving the infrastructure we already have. So I've talked a lot already. Again, thank you for your patience. Thanks for being here with us tonight. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tamika to talk a little bit more about herself and to tell us about what we can do to improve these conditions in Greater Cincinnati. So Tamika Butler, it's your turn now. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Wade. Thanks so much for having me. I'm very, very excited to be here. I'm gonna share my screen and do a PowerPoint. We're also gonna be using Mentimeter today, and some folks might not know what Mentimeter is, but Mentimeter is essentially just a platform where I'm gonna ask you a series of questions, and you're gonna be able to go and vote, and hopefully we'll make this as interactive as possible while also saving some time at the end to answer questions. So with that, let me share my screen. Let's see. Can everybody see my screen? Great, I can see Wade nodding. So I want to talk about why we need to talk about race when we talk about bikes. As I said, I first want to just check in with you all, take a temperature of the room, see who's here with me. There's been a robust chat thus far, but I'm hoping it continues. And so if you click on this link, or if you go to just menti.com and type in the code 4812652, that will also work. But basically, when you click on that link, It should open another window for you, and it should take you to a question asking you one word to describe how you're feeling today. Again, this just helps me, especially when I can't see everybody, when most of the people are not on video. It really helps me to be able to get a sense and take a temperature of who's in the room. And so I appreciate everybody's good nature and hopefully participating. Love it. Starting to see some of these answers come in. And hopefully you all are starting to see some of those answers come in. It's 2020, so tired and worried just seem like prerequisites, like part of the game plan. I'm glad to see that some people are excited and hopeful and happy. I hope that's still the case. After this, I love optimism. I always like seeing optimism, and so glad that is part of the equation for folks. I'm gonna give you one more second just to finish up. Okay, well, let's end it with hopeful in the middle, and see where we get. Thank you, everybody, for participating. I really, really appreciate it, and it makes my job easier. So hopefully you are back to seeing the PowerPoint. Wade, can I get a thumbs up if that's true, since you're the only one I can see? Great. Thank you, Rachel. So I'm a person who likes to set clear expectations. Let me tell you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today, who I am, a little bit about my job, and then if it makes sense to just shut up and bike, and then hopefully what you all can do. And again, we'll try to keep this as interactive as possible. I always encourage people to chat, even if I don't see it in the moment, if there's stuff I can grasp after. So if you have questions and you don't want to forget them, please do put them in the chat, but also appreciate any comments or things that come up for folks. So who am I? I'm Tamika and I love to bike. I have a lot of identities that I hold, but one of them is being someone who absolutely loves to bike. Ever since I was a kid and I got on my bike and I had that sense of freedom, it's a feeling I'm chasing all the time. It's why I do this work, for that same sense of freedom. I don't necessarily refer to myself as a cyclist, and you will notice that. I am someone who loves to bike. I have many identities. I'm Black, I'm queer, I'm Midwestern. That's probably the one that is most important to me sometimes. But I am someone who absolutely loves my bike, and that's what brings me to this work. So what do I do? Before July, I worked at Tool Design, a private transportation consulting firm that really focused on active transportation projects. And we have a great office in Columbus where I miss my colleagues dearly. But as everything started changing in the world and I needed more balance with my family and my son, but also as the side hustle became more of the main hustle, it just made sense to start my own business. And so I started Tamika Butler Consulting. What I love about what I'm doing now is I get to choose the people that I want to work with and interact with. I get to feel valued in my work in ways I never did before. And I get to do cool transportation stuff just like I was doing at Tool, with some other really interesting things mixed in. I'm working with museums, working with health departments, and working with how all these things come together. But at my core, again, I'm still someone who likes to bike. And, you know, sometimes that leads to people saying, well, could you just focus on bikes? Why do you always have to talk about race? And for me, I've always been a talker. I'm most comfortable when I'm in front of a crowd talking. And maybe that's why I went to law school. Maybe that's why I was a lawyer for a bit. But I'm most comfortable when I get to just chat with folks. This is when I was at a foundation leading an initiative for boys and men of color. And policing in schools, and the way boys of color were already criminalized in the school. This was a really hard job. Many of the jobs I've had, a civil rights lawyer, all of these things had a lot of secondary trauma. It was rough thinking about these issues every single day. And ultimately what it came down to is that I just felt so burned out from so many jobs and so many experiences I had at these jobs that I wanted to have a job that was more fun. I wanted to have a job that was more carefree. And so I had a friend who said, you should apply to work at the Bike Coalition. And this kind of caught me off guard. Now, this was a good friend. She was the same person who introduced me to my wife. She was the same person who first got me on a bike. She convinced me to do the AIDS Life Cycle, a ride that's 545 miles from San Francisco to Los Angeles. She hadn't steered me in the wrong direction, but I remember going to the Bike Coalition website and looking at all of the advocacy work they were doing, all of the work they were doing on urban cycling, all the work they were doing on trails and recreational cycling, and just thinking, I don't know, this might be too wide of an organization for me. And also just feeling like I was a civil rights lawyer and I was going to lose all my street cred. My friends were going to say, hey, you know, bike lanes are the first sign of gentrification. What are you doing? But, you know, I went to the interview, and when the board asked me at the end of the interview, if there was anything that I didn't, you know, I forgot to add or that I wanted to say, I said, yeah, you know, I'm a queer Black woman and that's how I see all my work. So if you don't want this bike organization to become a social justice or a racial justice organization, don't hire me. And so I was very, very surprised when I was hired, as was the bike community. Many of us who love to bike and love trails, we know that the community is small, right? Like you're used to seeing the same people, and no one really knew who I was. They weren't sure I was really somebody who biked. They found this old picture on my Facebook page and were like, she has a bike. We think she's a cyclist. But despite no one really knowing what to expect, it was an awesome job. Any of us who love bikes know that it is hard to go to work every single day where you get to be on a bike and not have the smile on your face. It's just one of the best jobs I've ever had. I mean, I also got to wear shirts that were wrinkled like this and no one cared. And it wasn't just that I truly enjoyed what I was doing. It wasn't just that I had made my hobby my job. It was also that we did some important work. You know, people thought I only talked about race, but we got some really cool things done. Los Angeles became a Vision Zero city while I was at the Bike Coalition. And then, even before folks were talking about enforcement and policing, we passed Vision Zero in LA with a coalition of groups that weren't just biking and walking groups. We had an affordable land trust. We had the Department of Public Health. We had a local health clinic in South Central Los Angeles. We had an organization focused on obesity prevention for the API community. We had a racial justice organization that was focused on police reform. We also had a youth organization that was focused on getting young people engaged and active civically. We were a coalition that really saw the power of bikes, right? Those of us, again, who love bikes know they can take you anywhere, but that you want to feel like you can ride your bike without worrying about getting killed. And so this was a huge victory for us. I got to be at press conferences all the time with the mayor, who some people think might be the next Secretary of Transportation. I was part of launching Bike Share in LA County. And 4 years ago, almost exactly 4 years ago, when the election was upon us, then we were out at a train station passing out M&Ms, asking people to support this ballot measure that did pass and that will never sunset, and was the first transportation ballot measure that allocated money specifically to walking and biking, from urban use to trail use. We passed a measure at the exact same time that we worked on at the Bike Coalition that was for parks. And so together, this transportation ballot measure and the parks ballot measure both ensured that there would be money for all types of cycling, no matter how you got around on your bike. We were really pumped. And you could say that, as I said, this was not only great because I love my job, but because I was in LA. It was a true Hollywood story. So I would be remiss not to also say that I got to go to the Emmys. I got to ride my bike up to the red carpet with this guy all the way to the left who's a producer on Mad Men. And I got to actually, you know, live out my Hollywood dreams. But like all good Hollywood movies, at some point they end, right? Like at some point there's a villain. And I will never forget that there was somebody running for city council, and not just any city council seat, but my district. And we lived in a district where people kept dying on this one particular road. And we had advocated for there to be a bike lane. We were told there was going to be a bike lane, but the council member just never did it. And I remember coming back from my honeymoon, sitting outside at a restaurant, eating with my wife, you know, when people sit outside at restaurants all the time. And we heard a loud crash, and we turned and looked, and a woman had been hit and killed. And that really changed a lot for the advocacy community. All of a sudden, we had this new candidate running for city council, and he was a bike guy. He owned a bike shop, all sorts of bikes. He liked every type of cycling there was. He was a big outdoors guy. Folks really felt like this was going to be the change we needed in our district, and people were excited about it. Now, when I say people were excited about it, not all people, not those of us who were folks of color, women of color, who had interacted with him and knew that he never treated us well, right? So it was no surprise to us when it came out that he was using the N-word on the dark, like, recesses of the internet, where he was saying that fat people deserve to be raped because of the bad choices they made, and transgender people just needed to be more decisive. None of this was a surprise. But all of a sudden, the bike community was at this decision point. And one after another, leaders in the community, as I said, it's a small community, started coming out and saying, he may have said these things, but he's going to get us a bike lane. He may have said these things, but he's going to fix that bike path that runs through our district and takes you through by the LA River, through the big park. He may have said these things, but he's going to get things done, right? And that's going to help me. And so I think sometimes as we watch history happening in real time, we wonder how people can sit by quietly and say nothing when some people are being oppressed or hurt. But the reality is, in the transportation space, we do that all the time. To try to accomplish one thing, we're willing to stay perfectly quiet. And for us, for those of us who know that the only way to do this work is to talk about race, we constantly hear, just like basketball players here, just shut up and bike. Why do you have to focus on all of these bad things? Bikes don't discriminate against people, right? Just focus on bikes. You know, bike lanes don't discriminate against people. Trails don't discriminate against people. And that may be absolutely true. Bikes don't discriminate, but cyclists do. People do discriminate. And so there's this group of us in this space who say, we absolutely have to talk about race whenever we talk about our work. That is the only option. But unfortunately, those who have historically been in power in our movement aren't really interested in that option. They don't want to talk about race. They don't want these things to be at the forefront. And so for those of us who have no choice but to talk about these things, because we're some of the few folks of color in the space, this is a lot. It's a lot to constantly be carrying that torch and having people tell you that it just doesn't matter. All of a sudden, you just start feeling like, I'm not okay. And I always give people the seizure warning for this slide, because that's how it feels to be a person of color trying to elevate equity in this space right now. And folks who have seen me speak before are like, I've seen all these slides, I've heard this before. And I keep saying, I'm gonna keep saying these same things, not because I'm lazy and lack creativity and can't come up with a new PowerPoint, but until people start to care, we have to keep saying the same things. But rather than caring, people usually just want us to, know, hey, but I'm not a racist. I didn't do anything. Why do we even have to talk about this? Well, the reality is we have to talk about this now more than ever, because our country is being ravaged by two pandemics right now, COVID-19 and systemic racism. Beyond just systemic racism, anti-Blackness. And it literally feels like we're in two separate countries right now, right? Where some folks are more worried about having their boozy brunch. Well, some of us are trying to reclaim public spaces. March in the streets and simply ask that people see us. Simply ask that people acknowledge our humanity. That's really all we're asking for. And the reality is, if you care about transportation, you know this isn't new, right? Police officers have always used transportation and transit to figure out reasons and ways to hunt Black and brown folks and ticket us. And again, it goes so much beyond that. This is part of our history. As I sit here in Los Angeles on stolen Tongva land, I know that our whole concept around recreation, around getting outside to a park, to a trail, is based in racism and white supremacy. It's based in a system where people theoretically came here and discovered something and wanted us to buy into this mindset that hard work would help you get ahead, but they got ahead from exploiting free labor, from enslaving people, and beyond that, again, by creating our beautiful parks and places where we can have trails, by taking land from indigenous people, putting up walls, creating a fee structure, and keeping certain people out. And that happened then and it happens now. When you look at who's using trails, when you look at who's going to national parks, it shouldn't be a surprise that the person who is called one of the four founders of our national park system also wrote a book that Hitler said was like a Bible to him. Because our use of the outdoors, our use of bikes has always been tied in racism, right? That is so true of transportation. Since Miss Rosa said, nah, not today, transportation and civil rights and talking about race and anti-Blackness, again, have always been tied. And it's not just transportation, it's our criminal justice system. It's our land use laws and zoning, and where are there trucks and industrial pollution, and where do we allow environmental racism to happen, and how segregated are our schools? And for folks who care about things like transportation and planning, a lot of us like to think about The Color of Law. If you haven't heard of this book, you should absolutely read it. It's great. I like the author. I've been on panels with him. But this is still a history that is very white-centered. People sometimes don't know what you mean when you say white-centered, but a book that subtitle is A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, that's a white-centered point of view. Because when you say it's a forgotten history to who? Sometimes when we start having these conversations about equity and racism, people will say, it's just 2020 is different. We just didn't see it before. But who's the we? It's not people of color. It's not people with disabilities. It's not LGBTQ folks. It's not indigenous folks. We haven't forgotten these histories. We haven't never looked at things like this before. It's just privilege works in this funny way. When something isn't a problem to you, you don't think it's a problem at all. And again, this is historical and built into the very fabric of our country, but it's also something that's important right now. We've all seen, or we should have seen, the stats that show us that this virus is killing people of color at a much higher rate. If you know somebody who is part of an oppressed group, you would be hard pressed to talk to them and not hear from them that there's someone they know who has been impacted by the virus, right? Someone who they've lost. I lost one of my friends. I had another friend call me the other day and say, my heart is beating out of my chest. I got COVID, right? It would be hard to talk to people who are in oppressed groups who don't know people who have kept going to work. Whether or not it's the farm workers in California when wildfires were blazing, who kept going to work and picking fruit for the rest of the country. Whether or not it's folks who are checking you out at the checkout line, the mail people, folks like my mom, who never had the privilege of sitting behind a Zoom screen and, keeping themselves safe because they had to serve others. And when we hear about all of these problems and how they're baked in, sometimes it feels overwhelming. And folks say, well, what can I do? And the first thing that I always ask folks to do is, yes, again, go back to Mentimeter. And for folks who weren't here before, I will repost because we had a few folks join since then. I will repaste the link. It should be the same link as before. And now when you go to the link, there should be something that says the presenter has changed the slide. Go to the next slide. And so for me, when folks say, well, what can I do? Well, first I like to start with, well, what do you want to do? What does equity mean to you, right? We all have to have that question with ourselves. And so if folks can take a few minutes, what does equity mean to you? So we're seeing a lot of things around fairness, right? Seeing a lot around equal opportunity, equal consideration, correcting the imbalances of power in the system. I like that. Someone got right to the core of power. We're seeing another equal opportunity. Mhm. This person is pushing back on that narrative. It certainly isn't the same as equality, a different approach to different situations. So we're gonna have to dissect that. Do we mean equality? Do we mean equity? You know, some people might argue that fairness is the same way. What's fair to some folks? I'll give you a couple more seconds and then I'm gonna ask you another question. Equity is building wealth in my home. That is one form of equity. And if that's the only thing you think about when you think about equity, then it's good you're here because we're going to talk about another type of equity. I'm trying to sell my home right now, so I'm thinking about that type of equity all the time. All right. This is our next question. I have to reshare. Have bicycling and/or trails contributed to systemic racism in the region? This is a yes or no question. This should be a fast one for folks. Getting a few responses. There's some folks who say no, a few more folks who say yes. I would love to hear a little bit from folks about what they mean by that. So if you go to your next question, say a little bit more. If you said yes, how? If you said no, why? And again, I'm saying that we have some new people joining, so you should just meet us at this link. And we're answering, you know, do you think trails and biking have contributed to systemic racism in the region, and how? Starting to see the answers roll in now. The east side to the west side Central Trails. Located in mostly white communities, so more white people use trails, which makes them less approachable to people of color. more available in areas of privilege, where the funding goes, right? So not even just thinking about the finished product, but where's the actual funding going? Suburbs. Someone thinks that trails encourage gentrification and pushing people of color out who are no longer wanted. Bike infrastructure being granted to more affluent white communities. No trails in African American and low income communities. I like this person. I think, I always appreciate folks who are willing to be brave in this space. It's also anonymous, so that helps. But this person isn't personally aware. And I think that's a question for all of us, right? Sometimes when you see these things, and theoretically you're all from a region that is the same. So for some people, they're not, they don't have personal knowledge of this, but for other people, we have a ton of examples. And so what is it that makes some people see it and makes some people not see it, right? Remember, we talked about how privilege work, that when something's not a problem to you, sometimes you believe it's not a problem just because it doesn't impact you. But it still might be a problem, right? It still might be a problem. All right. So let's talk a little bit about what it would look like to directly integrate this into some of the Trails work that's happening, right? Let's go back to our PowerPoint. So one of the things you just heard Wade talk about, which I think is incredible, is an active transportation policy platform, right? And one of the things we have to think about when we think about equity is, how do we get beyond just thinking about it and talking about it? How do we do something about it? And so Tri-State Trails has released this active transportation plan. And I love Wade's humility and earnestness about, never doing anything like this. And so one of the core guiding principles, right, is to take action to improve equity. I think these are out of order, but I think it's great that it's specific and that it's called out, right? One of the things it says is to meaningfully engage with underserved Black, Indigenous folks and folks of color, and try to work on legislating to prevent displacement, and also increasing the representation of people of color, LGBTQ people, and women in representation. These are lofty goals, and I love them. I think this piece around engagement and authentic engagement, for folks who care about this work, we have to start recognizing that engagement and outreach are not the same thing. Outreach is just going out and saying, this is what we're doing, right? We've all been in that space. True engagement is saying, here's what we're thinking. We think we want to put a trail here. And a community member says, we don't want a trail here. And you say, why? Well, because I don't think it's going to be for me. I think it's going to be gentrification. Why do you think it's going to be gentrification, right? Going into that back and forth. I don't want a bike lane. Why don't you want a bike lane? I won't feel safe biking in the street. Why won't you feel safe biking in the streets? Well, cars are going too fast, right? That's engagement, that you get into this back and forth, that you make it culturally appropriate and relevant for people. You talk to people in a way that relates to them. A great example is from the public health world. Some of us who are older remember the food pyramid that has different foods. But if you went to some communities and you showed them that food pyramid, maybe a predominantly immigrant community, they might not recognize those foods. So is that the best engagement? Or is that just outreach, telling them what they should do, but also without realizing it, telling them that what they eat is wrong because it's not in the pyramid, right? We have to start asking community members for idea, and we have to start trusting local leadership and really showing up authentically willing to listen. Knowing that engagement and outreach are not the same is huge. And then The policy platform cites the Harvard Business Review. They have done a ton of great research on Black folks and other, BIPOC folks, Indigenous, other folks of color who just aren't advancing, right? No matter the type of organization, no longer the field. This is certainly true in transportation. This is certainly specifically true in biking. And for folks who don't know this, how do you seek out these resources? How do you realize that your colleagues who aren't white are doing something we call code switching, where they might change up how they're talking in different spaces? They're trying to do things that white folks think are professional. Even that's not, it's not that they're being a different person, they're just changing it up. But that takes a toll on you. It's both necessary for your advancement and it takes a toll. And the reality is that even when organizations say they're trying, they end up staying white. And why do organizations stay white? Well, it's because organizational segregation is persistent. Whiteness still shows up as a key credential for moving up in organizational hierarchies. And at a minimum, we need leaders who care about these issues to stop thinking about discrimination or inequities or inequalities as these rare events. Oh, well, it's just what happened to this one person this one time. We have to understand that race shapes all of our processes, whether or not we're talking about a project, a specific trail, or whether or not we're talking about the structure of our organization, which is why I love that the policy platform doesn't just talk about projects, it also talks about who's making up the organizations that's figuring out what projects we should be doing, right? We have to start having these conversations, and they have to get away from focusing narrowly on a concern with feelings and racial animus. Like, we have to create space for those things, but we also have to create space for the fact that this takes a huge psychological toll on folks, and that we have to come up with resources to really help build organizations. We also have to acknowledge the reality that when we finally do hire people of color, particularly women of color, they often get pushed out of an organization. They start off and everyone loves them, and it's this honeymoon period, and it's like, look, we have a Black, right? We have a person of color, we have a woman, we have an LGBT person. And it starts to feel tokenized because that person starts to point out issues. They start to do their job, the thing they were hired to do. Tell us why our outreach isn't as equitable as it should be. Okay, I'm going to tell you, but in doing my job and in trying to work within the organizational structures and holding people accountable for the goals they say they articulated, all of a sudden the organization denies it. They say that this person is the problem. They start using coded language like, oh, there's just a communication issue, or this person isn't a good fit, and that person leaves, right? So I think the policy that has been put forward by Tri-State Trails is important, but folks have to not just think about what the policy says. They have to think about how it plays out in real life and how they're going to start working against it. And beyond just having one of the guiding principles be equity, what would equity look like integrated into the other policy pillars, right? So if one of the policy pillars is to plan and implement an active transportation network that is connected and safe and accessible for all users, well, what does that mean? When we look at the data, right, one of the things this says is that, there should be an investment and an adoption in Vision Zero, and that there should be a real push for that, right? Let's have Vision Zero. But if we really want something, we have to acknowledge that when you say something like for all, well, when you look at the statistics, Black and brown folks are more likely to be hit by cars. And so it's not just for all. We specifically want certain groups of people to have the same outcomes as other groups of people, right? And we have to just name that. We have to say it. So equity can't be a pillar on its own. Even when we write things about Vision Zero, we have to talk about what equity would look like in that pillar. When we talk about improving zoning and other regulations that really eliminate and at least make it feel safer for folks to bike and walk, to make biking a viable form of transportation for residents, we can't do this absent of equity. Equity can't be a pillar to the side. If we're thinking about equity and racism, when we think about making bicycling a viable mode of transportation for all residents, then we have to acknowledge that there are some residents who feel like they can't go out and eat Skittles on a walk. That they can't have someone say, "Ooh, this pandemic is stressful. You should get outside and exercise." They can't just go on a run in their neighborhood. They can't just be bike people who are out for a ride on their bike. Because this young man was stopped for a bicycle infraction and lost his life. Right? I used to run a bicycle coalition. I know a lot of white bike dudes. I have seen them get stopped by police officers for bicycle infractions and tell the police officer, "You don't know what you're talking about. I know the law better than you," and chew out a police officer. And if you are a bike person, you know someone who's done that too. But they didn't lose their life for it, right? There are those of us who do this work and care about making bicycling a viable option for folks. And so whether or not you've ever watched this video of George Floyd, which I have not, because I don't need to see a man gasping for his last breath while calling for his dead mother. But what I do know is that making bicycling viable by putting that green bike lane there did not save his Black life. And we have to start thinking about this in our work. We have to, yes, diversify our organizations, but we also, those of us who aren't diverse, have to think about these issues too. Because as folks of color, we want to be a part of this movement. We want to do this work. We want to be included just like everybody else. But we don't want folks to only know our name because we become the next hashtag. We don't want folks to only know our name because we had to die, right? And so for me, I want to give something to Tri-State Trails, right? Like they want to help. They have this policy platform. They want folks to adopt it and they want to know what it's going to take. And so if we go back to Mentimeter just one more time, I would love to hear from folks for this next question. What is one barrier that you face in centering equity in your work? What can organizations like Tri-State Trails, or what can your organization, what could you be doing? What are the barriers that make this difficult to do? Lack of understanding, time, too many priorities, money, right? Resources, the existing hierarchy, closed minds. Lack of meaningful relationships that move beyond tokenizing folks. This is a huge one, right? I appreciate someone's bravery in saying this. Fear of change. That's huge. That's big for so many of us. Not knowing where to start. This is a huge one. I think a lot of folks feel. Reservations trying to speak up for BIPOC folks because it's my time as a white man to follow. When do you step up? When do you step back, right? And I think that's what folks are also explicitly saying or implicitly saying when they say that the field isn't diverse enough. They're saying that they don't feel like they're the ones who should be speaking up. But even though they don't feel like they're the ones who should be speaking up, they, they don't want to put other people on the spot. And there's no one to put on the spot. Let's go to our next question. What support do you need, right? You've identified what the barriers are, so what kind of support do you need? Starting to see some of the answers come in. Political support, political will is huge. Leadership that listens and takes action based on what they hear. That's the thing, right? You can hire all the folks you want, you can have all the task force, but if leadership doesn't have that will, you can't get this work done. I like that one. Needs to be recognized as a priority, especially because on the last slide where we asked what the barriers were, someone said too many other priorities. So I like that this person said, well, let's make it a priority. Again, leadership needs to take a stand, step up, lead by example. Funding and time, huge. Opportunities for conversation, just talking about it more, understanding it more. Someone said my expertise, I appreciate that. More white people need to speak up. Centering the voices of people of color. We want to do better and we want to not be screw-ups. We also want to not exhaust people. Time, right? This is another important one. You can't do this work without accountability. Can't do it. I want to go back to the PowerPoint ever so briefly. We're almost there. Thanks for hanging in there with me. Sure. So I like to share this picture because a lot of folks, and especially that last person, right, who said your expertise, a lot of folks like to see me up here and think of me as an expert. And in reality, I'm just a person who cares about this work because I have a family, right? This is my wife, Kelly, and as you can see, she's white. And I always tell people she's Canadian, so she's super white. And this is my son. And the reason I share this picture is because Kelly and I come from very different worlds. Um, you know, Kelly's name is Kelly and her sister's name is Robin. When their parents named them in the 80s, they gave them these names intentionally because they didn't want them to be discriminated against when folks saw their resume. In the 80s, Robin and Kelly were still fairly unisex names. I come from a very different family. My parents met in high school in Omaha, Nebraska. My dad grew up in the projects. We are very Black. My mom named me Tamika and she named my sister Tanisha. She had a different perspective. If folks are going to discriminate against you, I'd rather they do it before you ever walk in the door, right? So when Kelly and I decided to have a kid, we had to find where we were going to meet. And beyond that, we couldn't judge each other based on where we were coming from or how we had been taught or how we had been raised. We just had to acknowledge that we were different and we had to find a way forward together while still holding space for our different backgrounds. That's not just because we're married. That's because that's what you do when you want to do this work. You have to realize that folks who care about equity are all coming from different places, but you guys have to meet each other where you are and try to figure out, how are we going to find a way forward? How are we going to do something to move us in the right direction while still holding space without judgment of one another, that we just come from different places? The other thing Kelly and I had to decide is two progressive liberal queers in LA. Like, should we raise our son without gender? No pink, no blue. Let him grow up and tell us what gender he is. Tell people to only use they, them pronouns, right? We thought about it. And ultimately, we decided that that would be irresponsible because the world is going to see him as a Black man. He has curly hair. He looks just like me, right? He's Black. And that is dangerous. as a mother of a Black boy, if you don't know what that's like, never knowing, again, if walking or running or riding his bike in his neighborhood is going to be his last day just because of the color of his skin. When the color of your skin is viewed as a weapon, you are never safe. And so for us, we had to raise him, yes, to be a Black boy full of joy, but also to know what it meant to be Black. So once we made that decision, my white wife didn't get to say, cool, you got this, right? Call me when he's 25. Like, you're the Black mom. I don't know anything about Black people. You figure it out. Anyone who co-parents with someone is probably silently nodding right now. Because once you decide to co-parent together, one of you doesn't get to check out, right? And so my white wife, my super white wife, she had to buy books about doing Black hair. She had to start realizing that we lotion all the time and just putting lotion on a tay whenever she could, right? Like, there are things she had to learn. And again, people who co-parent with someone, they understand this. But for some reason, we don't have the same logic when we're trying to do equity work. We think that if we're not part of a group that's been oppressed, we should just sit back and not say anything. We don't want to say the wrong thing. It's time to just listen. But what we don't realize is that actually puts more of a burden on them, just like it would have put more of a burden on me to parent. Kelly realized she had a role to play, but she didn't know what she needed to know. So she had to figure it out. She had to use Google. She had to read books. She had to change where she was getting resources and reading and listening to the news. She made some new friends, right? Because that's what she had to do to be the best parent she could be. And when we really want something, that's what we do. We don't do some like crazy marathon or trail ride or bike race without training first. We don't just show up. But for some reason, when folks aren't part of oppressed groups, they think they're doing a favor by stepping back. And you have to first realize that, yes, it would help to have diversity, but diversity isn't going to change everything because diversity, equity, and inclusion aren't the same thing. This is diversity, right? 90s clip art, where you just get as many diverse people as possible. Is that a person in a wheelchair? Put them in the front. Is that an older adult? Make her look really happy. Ooh, a religious minority? Him too. White guy? Put him in the back. Make it seem like it's hard to see. And then give us lots of women. That's diversity, right? Just get as many diverse folks as possible. But diversity isn't the same as inclusion. People think inclusion is just everyone feels welcome here. But that's inclusion level 101, and it's 2020, and we got to get beyond that. True inclusion, and a few people said this in the comments, power. True inclusion is when there is a shift of power. More than just having those exotic faces sitting around the table, are they in decision-making positions? Can they say yes or no to things? Can they move resources? Can they set culture? That's true inclusion. You can have a diverse organization that isn't inclusive. And if we want to get to equity, we have to have inclusion. A lot of folks said equity was the same as equality. We have that one person who said it's not the same. This is a visual that helps. If you're short and you get the same thing as the tall person, that's equality, but you still can't see. Equity is giving everyone what they need. And sometimes that might mean that there is a person who doesn't get anything at all, because that's what you need. But that picture is outdated. It doesn't show the reality where folks really are starting, and it also doesn't show what we should be trying to get to. The reason I do transportation work is for mobility liberation. I want people to freely be able to get to the people, the resources, the recreation that they want and they need, and to be able to do it freely. But I even hate this picture because it doesn't depict the invisible fences. Again, if you want to do true equity work, you have to talk about power. Because at some point, the fence we're not seeing is that someone still decided what we wanted to do was to watch a baseball game. Now, as I said, I live in LA, Dodgers, baby. So yes, I'll watch a baseball game. But what if you don't like baseball? Or what if you want to play in the game? What if you want to coach the team? What if you want to own the team? What if you are a budding entrepreneur and you want to have the exclusive peanut contract with the whole MLB, right? We have to start realizing that our communities have power. And true liberation comes from them being part of the decision making, them setting the agenda, them deciding if they even want to watch the game. That's when we can really talk about equity, right? We have to understand that as an individual, I can determine if I feel empowered. I, Tamika, can say I feel empowered, but I don't get to say I want to empower communities. That's a colonial mindset. That's a colonial mindset that is still based on this belief that some of us have power and we have the right to bestow it upon other people. But if we don't bestow it upon them, they don't have it. Community and the folks we say we want to serve, they have power, and we have to stop thinking about empowering. We have to start thinking about co-powering them. I'll end by just saying that to make this change, we have to create brave spaces. As I said, if you are a person who is going to pick fruit in the fields while wildfires are raging, while ICE is doing sweeps, it takes bravery. If you are a person who is trans and you use the bathroom that fits with your gender identity, it takes bravery. If you are Indigenous and you still speak your native tongue, it takes bravery, right? If you are Black and you know that your skin will always be viewed as dangerous, but you still live your full life, that takes bravery. So we have to stop having conversations about equity and racism and wanting to be safe. We can't want to be comfortable. We have to want to be brave. We have to be vulnerable. And we have to know that if we are doing this work right, we are going to make mistakes. But just because you're going to make mistakes, you have to keep going. And you have to keep pushing through. You have to hold yourself accountable. And only then can you have the real conversations where you challenge power and privilege and you try to understand them. And whether it's a new policy platform, a new trail, a new project, a new hire, a new program, you should always be asking yourself, who's most impacted by this decision, this program, this thing we're about to do? Who is most impacted? And then ask yourself, were they part of the decision-making process? And if the answer is no, you have to start questioning the power dynamics. You have to start wondering, well, we relied on data, but whose data? Why is somebody like me who's a consultant and gets paid $500 an hour an expert, but the person who hangs out on their front porch every day and knows way more about the community, they're not viewed as an expert? Why is a university that still has tests and things to get in that some people are kept out from viewed as having good data, but a community member who knows everybody and has talked to everybody, their data isn't good? We have to understand power and privilege. And to end this on a good note, I just want you to go back to Minty one more time and just answer the question, what would it look like if equity were achieved? People often say they don't know where to start, but that's because it seems so overwhelming. But just start by thinking, what would it look like if we did this? What would it look like if we had equity, right? And again, we had some new folks join who might not have seen this in the chat. So I'll just put it again, just go to the link and just share, what would it look like if equity were achieved? I love the answers already coming in. Happier communities, right? Because this is going to help all of us. It would be beautiful, I agree. Folks don't feel safe. I don't know. I think I don't know is such an important one because I think sometimes that stops us. And for me, as a person of color coming from where I came from, I wasn't supposed to live past a certain age. I wasn't supposed to get into Stanford Law School. And so we have to think about those folks. Think of immigrants. They don't know what's waiting for them when they get here. But sometimes when we know something could be better, when I knew there could be a better life than what was for my family and what folks had seen before, we go for it even if we don't know. Even if we don't know what that future looks like, we still do it. We still go for it, right? Before I wrap, I always like to just check in with people. I checked in with you at the beginning and I asked you to give me one word to describe how you're feeling. Now that we're at the end, I would love for you to just tell me, you know, I always say, finish one of these sentences. I think, I want, I learned, I feel. So just in a couple words, learn this, want this, think this, feel this. Just Let's have a checkout. Tell me where you are now. Ambitious, hopeful, pensive is a good one. Ready, I love it. Inspired, challenged, energized. I see somebody that's discouraged. My grandma always says sometimes it gets dark before the light, right? I think it's how do we, again, when you're being brave, you allow yourself to be discouraged. You allow yourself to say that out loud and to be vulnerable, but you figure out a way to keep going. Those of us who bike, right? I remember the first time I clipped in, I fell off the bike. And what did everybody say? Clip back in and keep going. Feeling discouraged is totally normal, but how do you keep doing the work? Determined, absolutely love it. I'm glad that so many folks are feeling energized and hopeful and challenged, right? Like that's a big part of this work. I, just want to say thank you to Tri-State Trails for giving me this opportunity. And, the last thing I'll say is that I think oftentimes we do this work and we go into communities and we say, we're here to talk about bikes or we're here to talk about this trail or this project. But we have to start remembering if we want to make equity actionable, that for the folks we're showing up to help, they don't lead single issue lives. And so this struggle is not a single issue struggle. We have to think about and talk about race and anti-Blackness and housing and all of these things, because it is the only way we're going to be relevant, and it is the only way we're truly going to create change. With that, I will pass it back to you, Wade. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamika. That was really fantastic. If folks want to turn on their videos, we could do a little round of applause. I was on a Zoom call today where they did that. That was cool. I thank you so much for sharing your story with us, for taking us on this great discussion. I know all of us are on our own journey to understand these issues more deeply, and I hope that for everyone here watching tonight that this was helpful and kind of taking you on the next step of your journey, wherever you are on that journey right now. So now I would like to open it up for questions, and we have several lined up that we're going to prioritize. But in the meantime, if you have a question, please write it into the chat. The chat has been going crazy tonight. So if you wrote a question before, maybe copy it and paste it again. And then I'm going to ask one of our executive committee members, Tanner, to either come unmuted or on camera. There he is. And if you could go ahead and ask your question, that would be great. Thanks. Oh, we got to ask to unmute. Okay, hang on.
Got it. Thank you, Wade. Thank you, Tamika. That was awesome. And I'm really happy you mentioned your Midwest roots so that we could all identify with you and not judge you for just being a West Coast elite. So I want to get to that a little bit in my question. Because I want to talk about representation. Cincinnati is way different than LA, right? And the bike community in Cincinnati is not monolithic, right? We have kind of a homogeneous look, but we know that there are bikers of color like myself and other identities. So the issue is not always, are there hikers, bikers, climbers, whatever of color, but is the language or the face of that advocacy being communicated? And that's why I'm so proud of Tri-State Trails' work right now with Wade. You probably feel this. I've been called a coconut by my family, brown on the outside, white in the middle, but I still bike. My youth employees, which we're working on 150 this summer, they bike to youth job sites with Groundwork Ohio River Valley. I'm interested in your Midwest versus West Coast experience. to help demystify the language and the impression that biking or whatever it is not for people of color or diverse audiences, especially because increased representation will mean more equity, I think, as it relates to policy, decision makers, and so forth. And even the conversation around gentrification. So I want to know what your experience being from the Midwest, living in LA, how that translates to speaking to a broader community where we need to come together more than be separated like we may be now.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Tanner. So I think, a couple things. Like I said, I'm a Midwesterner at heart. I remember when I went to Stanford for law school, part of why I went is because I was like, oh, I'm so Black, I'm so gay, and I'm not Midwestern at all. And then as soon as I got to San Francisco, I was like, I am so Midwestern. I always tell people that the difference is, in my opinion, like on the East Coast, people think that people are rude. They're not rude, they're just in a rush. And so you ask for directions, somebody gives you directions. Before you can even say thank you, they're on their way. On the West Coast, I think people are nice, and so they'll give you directions and they'll stay around long enough for you to say thank you. But in the Midwest, it's just different. We are truly friendly. We'll give you directions and then we'll say, you know what? Just follow me. I'm not at all going in that direction, but just follow me and I'll take you. And so I think, for me, it doesn't matter where I live. That's the personality I bring to all the work I do. Often when I'm doing equity work, one of the questions I get all the time is, well, how do you even begin these conversations? How do you, is there like a toolkit to do equity work? And your question is the reason I answer the way I always answer. If someone tells you, if you hire a consultant and they tell you they have an equity toolkit, you have the wrong consultant, because there is no toolkit. Because the reality is every community is different. And that's why I've never been a bike person who's like, bikes are better than cars. Because I'm from the Midwest. I'm always going to have a 4-wheel drive car that I can get through the snow with. That's just who I am. I don't care if I live in California and there's no snow, right? And so for me, I think it's this realization that you have to go to every community and you always start by asking. That's how you start these conversations. I think too often we start these conversations by telling people, let me tell you why I'm here. Let me tell you what we're trying to do. Let me tell you about this project. Let me tell you about my organization. We start these conversations by trying to tell people things, and instead we need to start by asking, right? And I think that really demystifies it. And the reason I think that, despite the fact that a place like Cincinnati or Columbus or wherever we might be talking about, or Omaha, might not be as diverse as a place like LA, the reason I think this work is actually in some ways easier in some of these places is because we are friendly people. And so it is not weird to start a conversation by building a relationship, right? And I always tell people that as a bike advocate, when I wanted to accomplish something, I showed up a ton of times before I ever talked about bikes, before I ever talked about a project. And so that housing advocacy group, or that group that was trying to start the new, get the library open back up, they trusted me because I cared about the community beyond just my issue, right? I used to be an executive director of an organization, and one of the best tips you'll ever get as a fundraiser is don't just go to people when you want money, right? Because then the folks who donate start to see your number and they don't pick up because they know you're just asking them for money. It's no different with community. We can't just go to community when we want something, when we want to get our project passed, when we want to get something done. We have to have a relationship first so that they trust us and that they're used to seeing us. And we have to get out of this myth that people of color don't care about these things, whether or not you're looking at the data, right? And I've already expressed that sometimes data isn't the best, but the League of American Bicyclists, People for Bikes, they put out data that are showing that the fastest growing groups of folks who are biking are people of color. They are starting to bike at a faster rate than anyone else. So just as a community, as an industry, we have to figure this out because our constituents are getting more diverse. But beyond that, folks of color have always biked. And so they don't fear the bike lane just because of gentrification. It's a fear because it doesn't feel like it's for them, right? Because folks of color have always been biking, whether or not you've immigrated from another country where biking was just more popular, or whether or not you're Black, right? I always say Black people invented bike share. Ayo, homie, let me hold your bike for a minute. I'm gonna bring it right back. right? Like, so in our communities, we've always used these tools, but we're just wondering if we've always had the graveyard shift at the restaurant and we've always had to bike home afterwards, but no one cared about a bike lane then, why do you care about it now? It starts to feel suspect, like you care about it because you care about new people who you want to use it. And the way that folks feel like you're not planning against them is if you plan with them. And so we just have to start by asking. And the very last example I'll give on this, there was, when we did Vision Zero in LA, there was an intersection where people kept dying, this one particular street. And so we got all of the experts out there and we looked and we were like, we have to change this intersection. You know, lane width, signal timing, turn radius, like all of these things we have to change. They invested a ton of money, right? Because they started with, here's what we're gonna do. Here's the problem we have to solve, and here's what we're gonna do. People kept dying. So they went out to the community after all of this and they started to talk to people. And what people told them is, there's a bus stop on that side of the street and there's a tree on that side of the street. And that is the only shade, because we also know that low-income communities of color are less likely to have sun shelters at their bus stop, right? Again, reputable source, New York Times, it tells us this. And so even though they fixed the intersection, people said, I'm standing over there because of shade. And by the time I see my bus coming, I don't have time to go all the way to the intersection. And there's a lot of older adults, grandmas and grandpas, who are trying to run across the street and they're just not making it. So had you started with a question, you would have not only solved the problem, built trust, but you would have saved a ton of money. And so this idea that equity and work is also more expensive and more timely, what's more expensive and more timely is trying to retrofit something. Whether or not you're talking about a house or whether or not you're talking about a project, retrofitting equity is always going to take more time and more money.
Thanks, Tamika. We got another question lined up. Rashida, would you like to come unmuted? Rashida is one of our colleagues and one of my colleagues at Green Umbrella. Got it unmuted.
Try again, Rashida.
Thank you. So Tamika, I just want to say thank you. Your presentation was excellent, and I am one of the many people who said that they felt excited and energized after hearing you speak. One of the themes that I thought was really important was you started out talking about kind of biking as freedom and how it felt like freedom for you. And you kind of wove in this idea of biking as liberation. And then you talked about how, sometimes trails can be unsafe spaces and for people of color, Black people specifically. And so it's kind of like this dichotomy between it being a liberatory space or a liberatory action versus being an action that can be unsafe and dangerous even just because of the color of someone's skin. And so that to me made me think about where you ended with this idea of the single issue and how single issues there's no such thing as a single issue. And so what I think is really important for us doing this work with multiple stakeholders is how do we get stakeholders to buy into or to understand that while we maybe we're going in wanting to focus on transportation, on biking, on housing, but there are all of these other issues that are important to address as well. How do we get them to buy into that and that understanding of, the multiple issues and how you did with the idea of liberation? It can mean different things to different people, and there are different strategies.
Yeah, one of my good friends, Charles Brown, who's a researcher out of Rutgers University and is on the board of America Walks and does a lot of work in the space, something he always says is, if you're a transportation planner on my staff, and you go to a community meeting and someone says, well, I have a housing question, and you say, well, I'm just a transportation person, I'm not the housing person, then you can't be my transportation planner anymore, right? And it's not because you're expected to solve that housing problem, but you have to be able to have empathy and to understand that that question might come up for someone, right? And I think that's one of the main reasons it's important to work with community-based organizations that might not be like bicycling organizations, right? If we think about that coalition I described for Vision Zero, because as the head of the bike coalition, if I was talking about a bike lane and someone was like, my rent's gonna go up and I feel like I'm gonna get evicted, I don't have that answer for them. But if I'm co-hosting this event with that local housing advocacy group, then they can step right in, right? And it, again, it builds more support. It builds a community where you're not just disregarding those issues, you're acknowledging that all of those issues come together. And so that's why it's also important for us to sometimes get out of our silo. And even if that doesn't mean train your whole staff on this issue that has nothing to do with trails, it means who are the partners that you need to be in coalition with, right? Because we saw at the Bike Coalition that we needed to get that transportation measure passed, but we also needed that parks measure passed. And folks might not have thought we needed to get the parks measure passed, but we were thinking about trails. And so who are those coalitions that you have to make? And then how do you pay those people and value them for their time, even if they're not bike experts? And then I think the other thing is thinking about privilege again, right? It's one of those things. When I was an employment discrimination lawyer, if a gay white man walked in and said, I was discriminated at work, and I said, why? He said, because I'm gay. If a transgender woman of color who didn't speak English and had a disability and was from another country came in and I said, why were you discriminated against at work? She'd say, ooh, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this, right? Same with me. When I'm walking and someone crosses the street and holds their purse, I don't know if they're doing it because I'm Black. I don't know if they're doing it because I wear men's clothes and they think I'm a Black man. I don't know if they're doing it, right? Like, but in my head, I'm running through all of those things. And I think some of us have the privilege where we don't have to think about those things all the time. So all we have to think about when we're planning the trail is, does this connect you to the places you want to go? And is this fun? Does it look pretty, right? But you have to acknowledge that there are some of us who are thinking about all of those things. Is this fun? Does it look pretty? Does it connect me to where I want to go? And am I going to feel safe, right? A man might not think walking down the street, is there enough lighting? Am I going to feel safe? But just because he doesn't think about that, if he knows moms and kids and other folks are going to be walking down that street, you have to start thinking about that. So part of confronting and analyzing privilege is realizing that, again, just because something's not a problem for you, it doesn't mean that when you say things like, we want this to be a good trail for all people, well, then you have to think about all people when you're planning it. And you don't just have to think about all people, you have to think about the things those people are thinking about. And if you just don't feel equipped to do that, then you have to figure out how to get them at the table and how to listen to them.
Thanks a lot, Tamika. That was great. Are there any other questions that folks would like to ask? I have another question ready to go. So one thing that I'm just thinking about now in this pandemic that we're all in, with an economic fallout pending or already here, how do we continue to justify investment in active transportation when there's going to be so many other competing needs that, I think many could argue are more pressing? So I'm just wondering if you have any reflections on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is where my real bike nerd comes out. So I will say, I've already said, I'm not a person who's like bikes over cars, right? Like, I have my SUV, it's a hybrid, but like, I'm not getting rid of it. But with that being said, I think that we have to start, again, not just talking about this as a bicycle issue or as a recreational issue. The reality is, in addition to systemic racism, one of our biggest other existential crises is the environment, right? Is climate change. And I think we have to start having real conversations. I know it seems like it was long ago, but when this pandemic first started and like the birds were singing louder, the air was cleaner, like allergies were horrible because all of a sudden all of the things were thriving, right? Like, it makes a difference when there aren't as many people in cars. And so I do think making active transportation more viable, it's not just something that I want folks to do because I like riding a bike, but it's literally essential to our survival. Like, we have to get more folks feeling like they could use active transportation and like they can use it in meaningful ways. And I also think that when you just look at cost, right? Like, It is an option, whether or not you're talking about active transportation or whether or not you're talking about transit. I think we have to start considering these options where for less of an investment, you could actually make real impacts. And then when you get away from transportation, I also think something that we have to, again, thinking about intersectionality, we have to talk about the mental health impact that this is taking on our country. Like we just do, right? Like we got a generation of kids. Like I have a 2-year-old, and literally we, like he he is afraid to be around people. like we did this thing where we like quarantined for 3 weeks, and then we rented a house with my wife, sister, and my brother-in-law and their 2 kids, and we went to celebrate our son's birthday. And when we all got to the house, the kids who are 2, 1, and 3, they were like, I can't get close to you, germies, right? Like there are some things that are gonna take some time, right, to bounce back from. And that really has an impact on your mental health. And I think all of us who love biking and walking know that that also has a positive impact on your mental health. And so I also think this is not just an investment in the environment. This is just not crazy bike people saying bike. We've seen bike sales just shooting through the roof. We know how hard it is to get a fancy electric bike and how hard it is to get a cheap bike at Walmart, because it helps to be outside. It helps to be in nature. And so I think we also have to start aligning our work with public health work, and start aligning and understanding that if a doctor is going to say to somebody, you need to get outside, you need to be more active, you need to do things that are good for your physical and mental health, biking is right up there. You can do it at any age. It is amazing. But if people can't have access to bikes, or if people don't have the infrastructure to do that, then it's not, biking is going to miss its moment. And so I think to truly capture our moment in this economic crisis and this health crisis, we have to start aligning with these other fields.
That's a great point. Thanks. Anybody else have a question? Otherwise, I have another one. So one of the questions you posed to us was about, have trails and bicycling had an impact on systemic racism here in Greater Cincinnati. And one of the things that I regularly think about in this work is how the trail network that we're trying to build is really going to be reconnecting communities that were dissected by the highways. And those communities were predominantly thriving Black communities back in the 50s and 60s that now is where our Interstate 75 and 71 go through. So could you talk a little bit about what other communities are doing to be proactive about trying to prevent displacement and gentrification, and how we can try to take some of those principles and apply them here?
Yeah. I think the first thing we have to do as folks who love biking and love transportation is we have to realize it's not neutral, right? My grandmother always used to say, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, right? And I think sometimes we like to think of this work as neutral work. And it's one of the reasons, again, I got into bicycling, right? I had worked at all these nonprofits. There was all this secondary trauma. And it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on, right? Like when you love biking, right? And I think there's something really special in that, especially in this world where we seem to be getting further and further apart across political lines. I think there are people who just love biking. And so I think we have to recognize the power in that tool, right? Like biking can be a tool of social justice and bringing people together. But in order to fully recognize that, we have to acknowledge that it's not neutral, just like nothing is neutral. We might say we want to live in a world that's colorblind, or we might say we want to live in a world that's free of racism. Those things are great, but in order to get there, we have to acknowledge that we're not there yet so that we can fight for them. And so I think when I ask, have trails or biking, been part of systemic racism? Well, the thing is, they can be part of fixing it, like you said, right? Reconnecting communities and people to resources. But if we're not willing to acknowledge that in the past, transportation, whether or not you're talking about the highway system, right, whether or not you're talking about, like, there's a reason, there's a saying, the other side of the tracks, right? Like, no matter what you're talking about in transportation, it has been a part of keeping certain groups of people as the other, keeping certain groups of people away from something, keeping certain groups of people on their side of town, not this side of town. And so we can't ignore that history, but that doesn't mean that biking and trails are racist. We have the power to change that by not falling into this falsity that they're neutral. We have to use these tools we have. We have to use this thing we love so much to not be complacent, to not perpetuate past inequities, but to be really conscious in what we're planning and doing to try to repair some of those harms.
Thanks. And I'm poking people behind the scenes here, and I'm going to poke Jason Barron and ask him to ask a question.
Let me unmute. Hi, Tamika. So I run the bike share system locally, and we're very proud of our Red Bike Go program. That's our low-income equity access program. We like to think we have one of the best programs in the country. Last year, we had 28% of all of our bike share rides were taken by members of our Go program, which we're really proud of. We spend a lot of time thinking about it, a lot of time working on it. I guess I just wanted to ask you, as you are kind of involved in this work and looking around to bike share systems around the country, are there things that you're seeing that people are doing better to make sure that those systems are more inclusive? Or are there things that folks need to look out for to make sure that they're not making some kind of well-meaning mistakes that end up actually marginalizing folks and pushing folks away, even though you're trying very hard to pull folks in, which I feel like you can see a lot in kind of well-meaning folks.
Yeah, I think that's so important, right? One of the big takeaways of equity work, and really sometimes equity work is just like relationship work. Like anything you say in equity is the same thing a couples therapist would tell you if you were in couples counseling. But one of the things to think about when you're doing equity work is like, yeah, and you know, your intent, like it matters a little bit, but not as much as the impact, right? Many things have gone wrong when planned by well-meaning people. And you know, the example people always say is like, if you know, you're playing catch in the park and you throw the ball and it hits somebody, you didn't intend to do it, but it doesn't mean that when it hits them, it doesn't hurt, right? And so you would never run over to somebody and be like, well, I didn't mean to do it. You run over and say, are you okay? Like, do you need anything, right? And so we have to worry about the impact. I think that, you know, one of the programs that people always really try to point to and lift up is in Philly. And the Philly example is so hard. Like they did so much right, but they also had a lot of funding. They got a lot of funding from foundations. And so I think it speaks to what some folks were saying, that sometimes to do this work, like you do need resources, right? But I do think Philly had a really good ambassador program. And they, in every aspect of their work, people from community would take over the bike share Instagram for a day. So it was in their, you know, communications. Bike share stations look different depending on what neighborhood you were in. I think sometimes with marketing, you know, we like to say we want something to be identifiable, so it needs to look the same in every neighborhood. And to a certain extent, it did look the same in every neighborhood, but it also, like, they had local artists paint murals on the ground, you know, on the wall next to where it was positioned. Those ambassadors in the neighborhoods got paid, and then they taught them how to be mechanics, how to do this. And so I think the Philly bike share system is really the example that folks really elevate as being one of the most progressive and one of the most insightful about how do you have a brand, but how do you relinquish some of that control. And I think that's really what made the biggest difference, that they were willing to relinquish some control and say, we don't know what's going to happen, but we're going to give this over to the community, and we're going to be okay with the fact that it looks and feels different in different places. And not only are we going to relinquish some control, but we're going to view this as a partnership. So we're not only going to let somebody take over our Instagram account for a day, but when they do it, we're not going to give them rules that say, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. We're going to give them some skills. We're going to say, here's how you track metrics. Have you ever used this tool? Here's how you do it. And so everything they did was intentional to both help the bike share system, but also to build professional skills and help folks feel like they were gaining. So it didn't feel like an extractive relationship. It felt like folks were both gaining from it. I think an example of a bad bike share system, LA, and I only say that because when bike share launched, I was part of a coalition that worked on putting together how do we do more outreach. And so they dropped a lot of station in low-income communities and communities of color. And then we went out and we talked to people. And not only did they do that, they hired local community members, community-based organizations to like be the models. Like they were all over buses, they were all over, you know, everything. And so they really wanted folks in these low-income communities of color to see people who look like them on the bikes. But anytime we went out to like a restaurant or a store where we had dropped a station, and we would say to folks, there aren't a lot of rides from the station, how come? And we'd be speaking to folks in their language, like, oh, we're not allowed to ride it. And you say, what do you mean you're not allowed to ride it? And they're like, well, this just showed up here one day. Like we saw these folks, we think from the city, they were wearing jackets and they put it in and they didn't talk to anybody. And so we didn't think they were for us. And there's similar stories from New York where they like dropped a bunch of bike share stations outside of projects. And like, there's always this one narrative that people don't do that because they don't want things to get stolen. But the other narrative is when things don't get stolen, they also just don't get used because people don't think they're for them. And so I think it is that process of like, how do you continually engage? And I think that's what Philly did do well. Even after they had some like tried and true folks, like every year they were kind of re-upping, going back to the community, making sure it was relevant. And so I'm sure those are examples folks know about, but those are the ones that come to mind.
That's great, thanks. I really love that message of relinquishing control. I think that's so important for folks to think about. And then just also just kind of so much emphasis on being a partner and being engaged and kind of thinking of it not like something you do once and then we've done it, but something you do every day. And you really have to live it as like part of your DNA, and make sure it's just part of everything you do. And it's just, you got to keep at it every single day. So thank you.
Thanks. I'm wondering if folks have other questions.
Hey, I've got a question, Wade.
Yeah, go ahead, Kathy.
Okay, great. Yeah, Tamika, thanks. Great presentation and discussion. I loved what you said about outreach versus engagement. And you've dropped some clues along the way, but I was wondering if you could maybe just discuss it a little bit more at length. There's like a number of community meetings I've gone to or bike-related meetings where intention of the meeting is engagement with Black and brown members of the community, and everybody who shows up is white. And I want to be real specific that I don't think it's that we care more. I think it's because we have a privilege of having more margin with our time. Often it's older people whose kids are grown up, but we just have more margin, or maybe we're just using the wrong tools to get the word out. So I'm wondering what you have, if you could just maybe talk a little bit more about that aspect of it, is how to, is there something we're missing to really promote this kind of healthy dialogue and engagement, as opposed to being well-meaning white people, but we're talking to each other instead of the people who really need to be there.
Yeah, that picture I showed of trying to pass that ballot measure, that was just, it was so interesting. We passed the ballot measure, and then a few months later, I left the LA County Bicycle Coalition and I went to this organization, the LA Neighborhood Land Trust. And the LA Neighborhood Land Trust built parks and gardens in low-income communities of color, a lot of parks, but also parks that were like 10 acres. And what I learned when I went from one organization to the next is how different the campaigns were for the transportation measure and the parks measure, right? So in the transportation measure, community engagement was important. When they did, the debriefing from the last election where it didn't pass because community said they didn't feel like they had a say so. And so they did more community engagement this time. We had a ton of community engagement meetings, but all of the meetings, the partners for the meetings were like local transportation agencies or like a local neighborhood council that happened to have like a bike, person from the bike coalition who was like, I'll host this community meeting. But it was really tied to government, like to different structures of government that had like a bicycle advisory committee or this or that or the other. And so we use like these pre-established structures that were in different communities, but to connect to people, we still really did much more of a top-down look at it. And when you showed up to these meetings, you saw PowerPoints, you saw slideshows, you got asked a few questions, you got a free water and like some chips and stuff, and then you went on your way. For the parks measure, the county said the only way this is going to work is if we get people invested, because too often people think of parks and trails as an extra, not as a necessity. And there's a lot on the ballot. And so we have to get folks at this moment where there's going to be high turnout because it's a presidential election, we have to get them to vote. And so what they did from the very beginning is they split the region into, even though LA County is huge, we only have 5 county supervisors. And so they split it into those 5 regions into even smaller regions. And then for every region, they picked a community-based organization. Whether or not it was a parks organization, they picked a community-based organization who had a deep tie in the community. They paid them. And they said, you're gonna help us with outreach in this community. What's the most popular park in your community? Great, that's where we're having the event. What do you need for this event to be successful? Childcare? Great, pay for childcare. Translators? Great, pay for translators. Real food, like a robust dinner, or like the county would be like, why don't we have the meeting at 11 and end it by 12, because then it's after breakfast and then we don't have to have lunch. And people were like, no, you can't do that. Like, you need a full lunch. Okay, full lunch, but you have to go from this list of approved vendors. Nope, that won't work. We're going to go from this list of folks who everybody knows, because when they go to this park, this is the person who's always at the park, or this is the spot across the street from the park. And so, I think to what I talked about with Jason, there was a little bit more relinquishing control for this, but the measure did way better, because there were so many people who knew about it. And it was things like, is the location accessible by transit? What time of day are we doing it, right? It wasn't the normal time. Some of those meetings were really late. Some of those meetings, were at different times in the afternoon. Again, the food budget was way higher. So that people, interpretation was even different. We're so used to saying, you speak Spanish, here's a headset. But they required that everyone had headsets. So even if you spoke English, you were wearing a headset, so that the folks who didn't speak English didn't feel like they were ostracized and like they had less to offer. Everything they did was different. And it started by saying, who are the community-based organizations that we're gonna like figure out our contracting structure. We're gonna figure out how to pay them. We're gonna get around the liability of having childcare, which was just to call it child watch, not child care. And we're gonna figure out all of these things we can do. We might not have this in a government building because people don't feel like they can come into government buildings. And so I think it's things like that. How do you look at events and how do you do them differently? And then the last thing I'll say, I worked for the city of Edmonton on a project, and something they shared, right, is like, we were trying to get this transit thing passed and we couldn't get people to come to our meetings. And so finally we just got on the bus, right? Like we're not going to just have a meeting. There's already meetings happening. So we're just going to go where people are. We couldn't reach young men of color. No matter what we did, no matter how many buses we got on, when young men of color saw us coming on the bus, they're so used to being police that they would get off at the next stop and we wouldn't be able to talk to them. There was, and in some ways this is stereotypical, but it worked for them. There was this huge 3-on-3 basketball tournament one weekend. They just went to the basketball tournament and started talking to people, right? They waited by the bus stop that folks were getting off of to get to the basketball tournament. And so I think there's this concept around, how do we get folks to come to the table. Like, we want a seat at the table for diverse populations. And I think sometimes it's realizing they don't want to be, they have their own table. They have their own table, they have their own barbershop, they have their own stoop, they have their own basketball tournament, right? And so often we say we want to help and we want to empower people by bringing them into our process and helping them understand our process. But the reality is, it also feels uncomfortable to be the only white person at a barbecue. So we don't necessarily want to go to the barbecue. But we're not acknowledging that it's just as uncomfortable for them to come to our meetings. And so we have to realize that there's already other tables and meet folks there.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question. Does anybody else have a pressing question they want to ask?
Could I ask one, Wade?
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Tamika, thank you very much. I really appreciate the talk and got me thinking about a lot of things. But I do wonder, isn't it really a kind of a privilege that here we are talking about investing time and money in trails, and yet our transportation service isn't even ensuring that people can get to work, or that they have to ride a bus for an hour and a half for transfers. And I know our city has recently passed a levy, but still, that's still an issue. So this is kind of an area of privilege, just by the fact that we've chosen this as opposed to this other pressing need for our city.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's something that's really hard for folks to grapple with. Some of the critiques when I was at the Bike Coalition is folks thought I was talking about everything else but bikes. And for me, it was like, well, because for some people, bikes are a luxury. Now, that doesn't mean that these folks don't like bikes. And it doesn't mean that when we need folks to turn out at a city council meeting, or when we need folks to turn in letters, these won't be folks who will do that. But we have to acknowledge our privilege. Like, we have to acknowledge that. And folks are surprised by how much work it does to just say that out loud to folks and let them know that you understand that. And I think part of that is that's why you also get into coalition with other groups, so that when you finally do ask the bike question, folks aren't just like, I don't care about that. Like, I'm worried about my housing. I'm worried about if there's even enough money for the bus, right? Like, I don't care about the trail, but instead they're saying, John's a good dude. He's been to all of our meetings about other things. So if he's telling me that this is actually going to help and that this is important, I always thought of it as exercise, but I see what he means, right? And so I think that's why we have to build relationships sooner. And then the other thing I think we have to realize is that a lot of us might use things recreationally, and too often our elected officials, especially, they see trails as an extra, because when they are thinking about using the trail, they're thinking about using it recreationally. But I've never seen a recreational trail that, if it has connectivity to job centers, I've never seen an urban trail that folks aren't using to get to their work every single day. Mm-hmm. And so I think we have to start again questioning our decision makers about, is that just your experience, or is that everyone's experience? Because what I think COVID should have taught us is that we have to get away from saying transit dependent or this dependent or that dependent. If someone is using this trail to get to their essential job, it's an essential job, which means we all need them. And so I might not be dependent on this trail for anything but recreation, but if this person who I'm dependent on is dependent on this trail, well, then I'm dependent on this trail, right? And I think we have to start shifting that mindset for folks. Sure, maybe you're not transit dependent, maybe you have a car, but if that person who's working at the hospital, if that person who's the janitor and cleaning up everything so we can stay safe, if that person who, right, like if there are folks who are dependent on something and we're dependent on them, then we're all dependent. And then it's not just merely a privilege. And so I think we both have to be able to acknowledge our own privilege. Like, yeah, I get to hang out on Zoom and talk about this and get paid. We have to be able to own that and say that out loud so that folks understand that we're not saying that this is the most urgent thing, but we also have to acknowledge that there are people for whom this is an urgent thing, and we have to elevate those stories too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Tamika. Thank you so much. Let's do another one of these silent round of applauses. I know I personally learned some things, and I was super, super impressed with the way that you made this Zoom meeting interactive. So thank you so much. And I hope you enjoy your evening in the West Coast as we're getting
Thank
ready
you.
to go to bed.
Thank you. I'm getting ready to do the marathon of a 2-year-old dinner and bedtime. But thank you. This was awesome. Your questions were amazing. And if anybody needs anything, feel free to reach out. I will put my website in the chat, and that's probably the easiest way to reach me. Oops, sorry, I did it private to Katie, but I'll send it to everybody. And then Wade, I'll send you a download of these slides so you
Great.
can see them. But thanks for having me. It's been a true pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks again. And thanks to everybody for carving some time out of your evening to spend with us. We really appreciate it. And I hope you have a great Halloween tomorrow or in 2 days.
Bye.
See ya.
Thank you.